Welcome, everyone. All right, we are up to a new chapter. We are continuing our 7 Noahide commandments class. And we are currently going through the book, The Theory and Practice of Universal Ethics, the Noahide Laws, by Rabbi Dr. Shimon Dovid Cowen of Australia. We are up to page 169. That's chapter 7 in the second section of the book, part 2 of the book, chapter 7. Now, the chapter 7 and 8 are going to be dealing with our belief, relationship, etc., with God. There's 7 official, formal Noahide commandments. And if one were to have to pick one and say, which is the main one of the 7, if we can do that, I think it's fair to say that the main one is the prohibition against idolatry, avodah zarah. And I say that because that, in a sense, is the most fundamental. And we're supposed to, the Noahide world is supposed to keep all the 7, as we've discussed many times, including our previous class, I think, because they are God-given at Sinai through Moses to the nations of the world. And as a matter of fact, when we speak of the Ger Toshav, or the non-Jew, the Noahide, who lives in the land of Israel and would have certain rights, he is one who eats nevela, which is meat which a Jew is not allowed to eat. It's an animal that died on its own, not through proper Jewish biblical ritual slaughtering. That's nevela meat, which is big time forbidden for a Jew, but it's in no way forbidden for a Noahide because it's not a limb off of a live animal. The animal died, and then they would cut it up and prepare it and eat it. So the one who eats the nevela, so the way that it's brought out is that he eats nevela and he's not an idolater, does not worship avodah zarah. And it doesn't always even mention what about the other 6. So according to some, at least, he need not observe the other 6. But the main thing is that the Noahide we're talking about, who has the rights, or the words of the Jewish people are supposed to give that nevela meat, is to one who is not serving, not worshiping avodah zarah, any other than the one and only God Almighty. So that's going to be the first thing that we're going to deal with, and let's see it inside. Chapter 7, belief in God. Overview. A, we're going to have the preface. The imitation of God as the address of values. Self-transcendence, focusing the imitation of God. B, the knowledge of God. The one creator, God. God in creation. The unity of God. Partnership. Idolatry. The service and apprentices of idolatry. C, the principles of faith. Creation, revelation, redemption. So we have a lot of very, very fundamental and, if I may say, heavy things coming up in this chapter. Now, again, just as a reminder, all but one of the 6, the way they're presented, are all negative commandments. They're all don'ts. You mustn't, thou shalt not. Except for the one of dinim, of setting up courts of law, all the other 6 are prohibitions. However, ideally, or in a deeper sense, as we're about to learn now, the prohibition against worshiping or serving idols or any other existence other than God Almighty himself, in the positive sense, is all about serving and worshiping God. So Yeah, step one is don't worship any other thing. But then this is going to lead to our relationship to God. And let us begin. Bottom of page 169. A, preface. The imitation of God as the address of values. The Noahide law, commonly set out as the prohibition of idolatry. Okay? Isur avodah zarah. Prohibition of idolatry. Is here discussed in the broader terms of belief in God. This is because there is discussion in Noahide law as to whether humanity is obligated only to negate the opposite of belief in God, meaning idolatry, or positively to believe in the focused monotheistic concept of the unity of God. In either case, this ethical imperative relates to an orientation towards God, which is one of belief. So even if you're going to take the former form, still it's all about God. What is the significance of an ethical imperative to believe, and how can this be understood? For the major world religions, ethical and philosophical first principles have been consciously acknowledged as transcendent values, which intellect essentially receives. Accordingly, it does not have problems with the concept of revelation beyond, prior to, and informing reason. It has been much harder for modern secular thought to acknowledge that its first principles are also outside reason. Secular thought has singularly exalted a supposedly self-sufficient and self-supported reason. So everything has to be logical and make sense according to secular thought. There's no such thing as, at least as a starting point, of going beyond the rationale or beyond logic and reason. On the other hand, the traditional believing organ of the human being, the soul, or the genuinely spiritual exertion of reason, is openly professed and employed by adherents of traditional religion. And therefore, by its very nature, religion subscribes to faith, belief, beyond the rational, beyond what I can intellectually grasp. Now, top of page 171. In Noahide theology, this believing organ, the human soul, is the mirror of God in the human being. In biblical terms, it is called the image, Tselem Elohim, the image, or spiritual likeness of God, which the human being was created, right? As we're all familiar, right in Genesis, in the beginning, when it comes to the creation of man originally. So it says, he uses two words, B'tsalamoi kidmusoi, two biblical original Hebrew, the holy tongue words, B'tsalamoi kidmusoi, which basically we're translating as in the image of God. In the complex unity of the human being, which consists of soul, intellect, and body, the soul is the principal aspect of the person. In the words of Viktor Frankl, the soul has intellect and body at its disposal for the tasks and challenges which the person faces in life. In other words, it's almost like saying that the intellect and the body are the tools. Or if you would put it in his terms or in philosophical terms in general, who are you? Who is the me, the I? When I say I want or I am, who is that? What's the human I? You're going to tell me that it's my intellect? That's very limiting. I'm my intellect? No. My emotions? No. My physical body? No. So who am I? Well, for the religious person, it's an easy answer. My soul, whatever that means. But that's my spiritual entity, my spiritual being. Now that manifests itself. It comes into, it uses, the tools are the body, the intellect, etc. Intellect and body may prove to be unruly vehicles for the soul. The distress, passion, or predicament of either can threaten to, or in fact, overwhelm the sovereignty which the soul, or as it is sometimes called, conscious, is supposed to possess. See, that's when we run into trouble. So to say it's a tool, my intellect, my body, that's nice and that's ideal. But as we all know, all too often, that's not always the situation. In other words, I am my soul, which is some spiritual entity which is not tangible and may not be easily defined. Okay, now that we've clarified who I am, that I'm not easily defined, now I'm in my body. The body belongs to me. I'm not my body. My body belongs to me. And I have this amazing gift called intelligence, rational mind. That's my intelligence. That's not me. It's my mind. It's my intelligence. And they're supposed to serve me, or me serving God through them. The problem becomes when, as he just described, distress, etc. Nevertheless, intellect or reason is inherently secondary to the soul. Reason needs first principles with which to work, and it obtains these principles from outside itself. Got that? Let's read that sentence again. Reason needs first principles with which to work, and it obtains these principles from outside itself. In other words, you don't invent intellectual concepts. There are truths. There are concepts. And then my mind computes that, absorbs that, understands that, and then uses that. So it starts off with outside in. It should be the soul which provides those first principles, given the true place of the soul in the inner hierarchy of the person. The lower bodily faculty of emotion and instinct should certainly not usurp this function of the soul in orienting conduct. When it does, mere disposition and temperament, emotional, psychological passion, or material interests supply the first principles, which are elaborated by intellect into a worldview. And that's not good. You don't start from within yourself. For pure reason, on the other hand, to acknowledge that its first principles originate outside itself is a test of honesty and humility for reason. And when reason does acknowledge that its first principles come from without, it then has the problem of identifying and justifying the source of these values. If not in the soul, honest secular reason must find its first principles somewhere else and justify them. In a moment of such honesty and humility, this is acknowledged by a contemporary central figure of secular thought, Jürgen Habermas, who writes, the starting point for the philosophical discourse about reason and revelation is a recurrent idea, namely, that when reason reflects on its deepest foundations, it discovers that it owes its origin to something else. In other words, there is something higher than reason, something higher than my understanding. My understanding is taking in and accepting and computing something from outside, something higher, something greater. Habermas upholds a model of a liberal democratic constitution structuring rational discourse, whereby individuals relying on no more than their own intellects can supposedly elicit a consensus on values expressing a common good. Yet he acknowledges that this model, which he calls proceduralist, itself rests upon a belief, i.e., an ultimate insistence. The proceduralist understanding of the constitutional state insists that the basic principles of the Constitution have an autonomous justification, and that all the citizens can rationally accept the claim this justification makes. In other words, everything makes sense. So if you are, quote unquote, normal, you buy into it. And everybody is on the same page. Everybody's on board. This is a belief in the first principle, the rational discourse established by the secular liberal democratic constitution. It is also a belief, which follows from this, that whatever policy the rational discourse of this society brings forth is a warranted one. There is a necessary connection between the basic belief and the specific ethics which the basic belief yields. Herein lies a crisis for Habermas in the basic principle. He is nagged by the failure of contemporary societies on the basis of a civic discourse alone to achieve a consensus, solidarity, on values which can genuinely motivate citizens. Here, Habermas concedes that religion, on the other hand, has been a source of such values. It is in the interest of the constitutional state to deal carefully with all the cultural, including religious, sources that nourish its citizens' consciousness of norms and their solidarity. Consequently, he writes, there should be an extension of public recognition to religious fellowship in view of the functional contribution they make to the reproduction of the motives and attitudes that are socially desirable. Habermas is noting what a secular, liberal, democratic society based on rational discourse have omitted to achieve. Does not consider some of the commissions of this model. That a liberal, democratic society, Sweden, has overturned what even many secularists still instinctively perceive as a universally practiced cultural value, the prohibition of incest. This democracy has legitimized for the incestuous marriage of half siblings. Democracy without religion can produce values which, from the long-term perspective of civilization, are not societally desirable. Noahide law has a principle with which specific ethical outcomes are associated. This principle is the imitation of the divine and the associated values, the godly ways of conduct, which imitate divine attributes. Translated concretely into the Noahide laws, these values and ethics have their morally cognacy from the principle from which they derive, God. The second concern of Habermas for secular society, after the problem of achieving consensus, solidarity on values, is the issue of motivation. even were values to be agreed upon through a public discourse, would they then motivate conduct in actual practice? The success of religion, and specifically the Noahide laws, is that these motive, because they have to do with the experience of God. So they do motivate. And because their authority is that of none other than God Almighty himself. So a person behaves ethically according to the Noahide laws as a result of knowing and experiencing whose laws these are, and of standing constantly in the presence of the seeing eye and hearing ear of God. Again, we've had this before in the first part, but that's a paraphrase of a Talmudic statement where you are to realize that there's always an eye that sees and an ear that hears. And that's the training and the education that every human being should have. So when you have a Noahide who understands and he really takes note that God hears and sees all, then his behavior is in accordance. That is why the Noahide law relating to belief in God or prohibition of idolatry relates to the other Noahide laws, like the coronation of a king or acceptance of a government, does to the acceptance of his or its laws. In other words, the first thing is you have to accept the king or the government, and then everything else falls into place, or there's a chance for you to hear the laws and then accept them, of course. Similarly, in our relationship to God. There is no concealment from the presence of God, which could allow one a double standard, a private indiscretion, which is outside the hard light of conscience. The Noahide law relating to belief in God is foundational for all the other Noahide laws, because it establishes their address in the imitation of God and their authority in the knowledge and sense of the presence of God. So basically what we're saying over here is the reason why the first or the most important and most fundamental of the seven is the prohibition against idolatry, or more comfortably put, the belief in God, is because once you've established that, and once you've accepted that from without into, and going within, and you're now humble enough, and you accept that authority, now everything else will fall into place. And now you can understand and accept what does God want, and that's the imitation that the person is supposed to be similar to and copy and be in the image of God. Now again, this is the ideal form, as Maimonides puts it, that ideally everybody is supposed to keep these God-given laws because they are just that, God-given. Even though, as we've mentioned a number of times, if a person is keeping all the laws, all the 7 Noahide commandments, just because they rationally make sense, meaning he's starting off with the point of his intellect, which that's an option, it's a possibility. That's definitely not ideal, but it, so to say, can work. Then that is definitely better than not. But that person is not considered from the Hasidei U'Masaylam, from the righteous or the pious of the nations of the world. And then the two different versions of what it should say, then next words in Maimonides, either it says he is just from the wise of the nations of the world, or not even from the wise. But at any rate, he's definitely not from the pious. Page 175. Yeah. Self-transcendence, focusing on the imitation of God. And I must admit, this is a very high level of demand that we're making. This is the ideal situation. The imitation of God is not for the individual human being to discover anew and alone. It was taught and experienced through the revelation of the Noahide laws, particularly and definitively at Sinai, though it came also from earlier generations and their prophets. You know that the first man, Adam, was given the 6 laws, and then, of course, Noah, Shem, Aver. So there was such a revelation and a school and teaching, but really what, so to say, seals the deal or makes everybody today obligated, or we have the whole discussion. We've mentioned this, that the Talmud says that initially when God gave the 7, at some point, mankind was not keeping them. So God, so to say, he tiran, he let them go. He removed the prohibitions and he made it optional. And therefore, if a person were to keep them, he would get rewarded. But if he were to transgress, he would not be punished. God said, I'm dropping them. No. They became optional. I think so. I think I said it right.
You're talking
And
about
then,
Mitsuve, Lo Mitsuve,
which means,
I believe.
which means he
I'm
gets
sorry.
a lesser reward,
Sorry.
reward, but no punishment because he's not mitzvah. No mitzvah, not commanded, but voluntarily keeping. And then, by the revelation at Sinai, by the beginning of the Torah, according to most, the way that they learn it, that's when it became obligatory. That's when it became mandatory again, or sealing the deal. And then there's no turning back, or there's no saying that it's Eina Mitzvah V'Oiseh. But as far as the 7 are concerned, and everything that's directly related or under the umbrella of the 7 is Mitzvah V'Oiseh, mandatory, commanded. And therefore, there's reward and punishment. It has been transmitted through generations down to this day. What can be asked of a person is experientially to insert oneself into that received tradition and to confirm the Noahide law's moral imaging of and resonance with the divine. So basically, it's up to each individual. You want to plug into the reality, what you need to do or not, but it's an obligation for each individual to do. To do this, however, is possible only when the human soul is revealed. That is, when there is a consciousness of the spiritual faculty within oneself. His argument here is, otherwise, how in the world are you going to do that? This means that the spiritual faculty in the human being is brought forward, and the person actually ascends beyond the interests and biases of his or her psychophysical, intellectual, and bodily emotional self. You know, in a sense, it goes against your very nature. Because by nature, the human being is selfish, is biased. We by nature, as an infant is born, before they're even, you know, they made, of course, so many studies, before there's any outside influence, before any environmental effect or influence, the human being is selfish. So we have to go against that to go to our true self, which is the soul. The practiced conscious assertion of the soul sovereignty within oneself is the conscious life exercise of the religious person. So you have to make a conscious decision and say, I am going to pick that which is, at least initially, not convenient, not natural for me. When I say me, I mean what we normally refer to as me, not the real me. my intellect, my emotions, my physical body. For those outside personal traditional religious experiences, but wishing to understand the religious standpoint, this calls for the exercise of their own spiritual faculty. Here is the initial misunderstanding of a secular thinker such as Habermas, who mistakenly seeks to reclaim a religious concept with all good intention by mistranslating the religious concept of man in the image of God. And how does he misunderstand that, mistranslate that? Into that of the identical dignity of all men that deserves unconditional respect. This goes beyond the borders of one particular religious fellowship and makes the substance of biblical concepts accessible to a general public that also includes those who have other faiths and those who have none. Now, it is true that the religious concept of humanity, man in the image of God, does include notions of the equal dignity of every human being, as well as of the freedom and creativity of the human as made in the image of God. Yet at the same time, it means that they are made in the image of the one God. That means that notwithstanding their individual mindset differences, which in Noahide law will be expressed in a unique style and contribution in the service of God, they are all able to relate to, imitate the same set of basic divine norms, even though we're also different. All souls which look upwards see the same thing, supposedly unaided intellects, which in fact are informed by personal dispositions and interests below, do not. Habermas envies the solidarity of values amongst religious fellowship and the motivational power which they exert. However, he will admit religious principles into a secular discourse only on the terms and conditions of that discourse, which in fact exclude religious experience, because they allow not spiritual, but only intellectually accessible contributions. So that's no good. Notice his highest form is intellect. A liberal political culture can expect that the secularized citizens play their part in the endeavors to translate relevant contributions from the religious language into a language that is accessible to the public as a whole. For Habermas, only reason, not spirituality, is public, since his secularist philosophy, aware of its fallibility and of its fragile position within the differentiated structures of modern society, will nevertheless insist on the generic distinction, which is not at all meant in a pejorative sense, between the secular discourse that claims to be accessible to all men and the religious discourse that is dependent upon the truths of revelation. Habermas hankers for the sensus yielding and motivational power of religious conviction, but will not allow use of the faculty, the soul, which makes it possible and available to all people. So you're basically withholding the tool. You're not allowing yourself, by limiting religion to intellect, that's almost like an oxymoron. It doesn't work like that. You need the soul, you need spirituality. Habermas justifies this on the grounds that there are those who are simply unreligious, or in terms borrowed from Max Weber, are religiously unmusical, insensitive. With this, he exempts a secular public from the spiritual exertion required to reveal the soul and its perceptions. Simply saying this person just doesn't have it. Doesn't have what? You're a human being. You do have it. Can't just let them off like that. In fact, without requiring religiosity, the plane on which all can be asked to meet is that of self-transcendence. Viktor Frankl established a psychological therapy known as logotherapy, through which he encouraged patients to find a self-transcending meaning in their lives. He himself had a religious belief, but he did not attempt to teach his patients religion. Remember, we spoke a lot about him at the beginning of the book. It would have been therapeutically unsound to do so, since a religious viewpoint would have been imposed rather than fully owned by the patient. So by definition, what he stood for, Frankl, he wouldn't allow himself, under any circumstances, to force or impose or push religion on them. Of course, he would like them, philosophically, to get to that point as well, but you can't. The whole point is they have to get to it, or the point is self-transcendence. Yet once the patient, even one who was previously atheist or agnostic, had, in the quest for meaning, transcended his or her own psychophysical interests, Frankl observed that he or she was already en route to religious consciousness without having come to that terminus. You know, it's almost natural. It's almost a given. It's a pretty interesting, from a philosophical point of view, it's a very powerful argument for religion that as soon as you truly give up self, you automatically go and take some route of religion. So also in politics. Though this is something which needs study and analysis, we can argue on the plane of genuine self-transcendence, all can communicate, persons of religious backgrounds and of none. Just as one may ask of a secularist an exertion of self-transcendence beyond the psychophysical to uncover the spiritual faculty within him or herself, the same can be asked of the purportedly religious person. The purpose of this exercise is to remove pathologies which dress themselves up as religion. The terrorists who invoked religion to justify the intentional killing of the innocent, or Hitler's soldiers whose belt buckles with embossed with the words, "God is with us." That's like so beyond disgusting, beyond heresy. There's no words for it. We're not engaged in a genuine self-transcendence towards God. They claimed they could say what they want. That wasn't at all, it was the furthest thing from the truth. Rather than leaving personal interests and passions behind, they had simply idolized and transfigured personal passions and material interests as religious worldviews. Their version of religion is the opposite of self-transcendence. They say God, but they mean themselves. Their God is a projection of their own projects and passions. There is a remaining seeming paradox in the Noahide law requiring belief in God, and that is, fulfillment of this law or instruction seems already to presume the acceptance of the one who commanded it. That's a famous thing. No, how could there be a commandment to believe in God? Who exactly is commanding you to do that, right? Philosophically, how can believing in God be a God-given commandment? It's assuming that you already believe. In fact, this law does not command a person to acquire a faculty of faith, but to uncover and give explicit content to the faith, which one already has in potential in one's spiritual faculty. That's basically how we answer it. This is set out in the following section, B, as a requirement to contemplate the unity of God to the extent required by Noahide teachings. And the next section after that, C, to extend this knowledge to the one God into the dimensions in which God relates to the world, creation, revelation, and redemption. Basically, Hasidus, Tanya, Shari Yichud Ve'amunah, the gate of unification, and faith. So, without getting too philosophical, too deep, let me try to just simplify this last piece. The question is a very logical question. How can there be a commandment to believe in God? Who's commanding you? Your father? Your mother? God is commanding you? Well, excuse me, you can't tell me to believe in you, because either I do or I don't. If I believe in you, now you can tell me, these are the do's, these are the don'ts, here's what I'm telling you to do, here's the instructions, or whatever. So basically, everybody, from their true I perspective, not the self that we're familiar with, but the true self, the soul, the spiritual, need not be commanded or told about the existence of God. It is the most natural thing beyond intellect. We have faith. We do know. And I don't mean know in the intellectual knowledge. We have the gut feeling that, of course, there's the truth of God. Now, what he wants us to do, what we're commanded to do, is to go against our nature of selfishness and ego and bias and uncover and reveal that truth that we have deep down inside of us. That's basically what we're saying. And then we're going to take it on to study the knowledge of God, etc. Okay, this was quite deep, I would say. And we'll open up now for any discussion, clarification, questions, or whatever. Please, anybody. So either everybody understands. Okay, go ahead, James.
Hi, Rabbi Turn. Thank you. This is really something that I've been thinking about a lot, and we're doing a non-Jewish study in Tanya as well. So how to get people to the stage of Hasidei Umot Ha'olam from a Hasidic perspective. In other words, this element of bittul, this it's sometimes translated as self-nullification, but submission.
Right.
But before you can do that, you have to have that realization of bittul of yourself before you can relinquish it to Hashem or some such. And this concept of noga, that shimmering light that from a non-Jewish world born into non-Jewish culture and things, initially that's how we as non-Jews could potentially see Hashem. It's concealed. And so this part of what he's writing about is very interesting. Of course, he's coming from a psychological perspective. I don't know his technique on how he did that. But I think a lot of times about maybe how Avraham did that with non-Jews that he befriended and things like that. There's got to be some kind of process. And the closest thing I can think of is chesed, being kind to one another, to show people to think outside of their own self, so to speak. What are your thoughts about that when it comes to chesed, Hasidei Umot Ha'olam, applying that and changing that person out of their selfish world, that concealment, and showing them a bigger world that they can be a part of as well, or you know what I mean? Not all in this world, so to speak.
Well, allow me to think out loud, if you will. I am not absolutely or 100% certain, or I don't conclude with what I'm about to present, but these are my thoughts. First of all, he is taking it from an intellectual perspective, which is what Hasidus Chabad is. That's the approach. See, the basic, as you know, James, and many of others know, some don't yet, the most basic text, the book of Hasidus, of the philosophy, of that deepest portion of the Torah, which became revealed by Rabbi Yisrael Baal Shem Tov some 300 years ago, the most basic of all of the hundreds, literally, hundreds of volumes, is the book called Tanya, which you think you have a study session after. That's great. The Tanya, the first section of the Tanya, has the front page, where the title page. And the 2-3 lines of that page were actually written by the author. And he has over there a few words. He tells us which verse it's based on, this entire book of his, the first section at least, that it says in Devarim and Deuteronomy, for it is very near to you to do, basically, in thought, speech, and action. And he says the purpose of why he wrote this book, the objective of this text, is to explain clearly and very well, and then, this is the part I'm getting to, in a long, short way. The derech aruka ukitzara, in a long and short, or long/short way, with the help of God. Now, there are a number of explanations and interpretations to what he means there, one of which is as follows. There's short ways to get to a certain point. And in this case, that would be religiosity or observance of the mitzvahs, of the commandments, or to make sure not to sin. Then there's a long way. Now, of course, one may ask, why take the long route if you take the short route? Well, the longer route is a lot more work, and it's not just more satisfying, but it's more grounded and it's more internal and it becomes more real. And you can give so many examples in life, nothing to do with religion, how you could take the shortcut and that can't compare with all the work and effort that you do when you take the longer way. So the approach of the author of the Tanya, the Alter Rebbe, Rabbi Shner Zalman, who's the 3rd generation of Hasidus, and he is the founder in the 1st generation of Chabad Hasidus, is to take the long route. Meaning, to get to the heart, to get to love and fear God, and to get to what's most important, behavior, to behave properly in thought, speech, and action, it has to go through the brain, generally speaking, to use the mind. And I think that's the approach that he's taking. Now, what I just said now, that I don't, my disclaimer doesn't apply to that. But I just said now that's factual. That's all that I'm sure of. But now this part is what I made the disclaimer. For the Noahide means every non-Jew out there, every human being that's not B'nai Yisrael, that's not Jewish. So that includes so many different types of people on so many different levels. And they are all required to keep all of these commandments, ideally because they're God-given. Not necessarily is the way to get to everybody through philosophy or through intellect. That would be the highest form. I'm not even speaking spiritually about the Noiga or the 3 Klipas. I'm just saying from a very humanistic, personal approach. Some people get inspired in a different way. So this, I think, is a very specific approach. It's the highest form. That being said, the second point I wanted to make is it's very interesting. Nothing is coincidental in the language used in Torah sources. And James, you said chesed, kindness. They are called, the nations of the world that are keeping it because they're God-given, chasidei umesa'olam. And again, I don't know English well enough and how to translate it. So the English word that's thrown around and translated is pious, Pious, pious. Chasidu Mesoilam, as opposed to other words that it could have said, which would have been, again, I guess in English would have been the righteous. Tzadike, Umesoilam. Tzadik, doesn't say tzadik. It's chassid. Chassid, which is definitely associated with the word chesed, same word. Likewise, it's not a coincidence. And I'm not going to give you a whole lecture now on the beginning of Hasidism and its how and the opponents to it and how it developed and how when all the dust settled and so to say all the chips fell into their place or whatever the expressions are, Hasidim are called Hasidim. And the teaching, the philosophy is called Hasidus. This is all going to the word chesed. So yes, I really think there's a lot to the idea of that approach, which means kindness, which means giving, which means light as opposed to necessary contractions or concealments or withholding. So that's chesed, and that's chasidut meso'olam, and all these other things which are intertwined. And they are definitely related.
Oh man, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. I think people really want to hear those kinds of things as well, because I think that touches a lot of people in our community.
Right. Again, let me just underscore. I don't want to get too complicated. The 7 Noahide commandments, interestingly, as I keep emphasizing, 6 out of the 7 are prohibitions. They're don'ts. They're negative. Do not, do not, do not. And we all know that officially the punishment, the penalty for transgressing is capital death penalty. That's very extreme. And what is a person, a non-Jew, who does keep them for the right intention called? A chassid of the nations of the world. Chassid means kind. So it's pretty interesting of how they seem on the surface to be very strict. They're prohibitions. Don't. And yet one who keeps them is a chassid.
Do you think that's because Hasidim Olam have an element of bittul, and so when they take on that yoke of Torah, then the Jew can say, "Oh, this guy is Hasidim. He's from the kind ones of the peoples of the world," and it's like a unification, like they're coming into Malchus.
Something along those lines. Again, I'm thinking out loud, and it's not absolutely concrete and solidified in my mind, but something along those lines.
Right, yeah. Right. No, I totally appreciate it. I understand. And thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you for the class.
Anyone else? All right. So next week, we're looking at, with help of Hashem, bottom of page 178, the knowledge of God. And again, really, this is going to be much based on a number of places, but a lot of it, of course, is based on the Tanya, the second section of the Tanya, called Shar HaYichud Ve'emunah, 12 chapters of the gate of the unification of God and the belief in God. And for those of you that are already studying that, amazing, keep it up. And for those that are not, try to join a class in it, or at the very least, get a Tanya that has it translated into English. And then in the back of the Tanya, there's a whole section explaining lots of these concepts, and then do your best. It's not easy. Those 12 chapters are very logical and clear and systematic and difficult. All right. Wishing everybody all the best. And we're looking hopefully at next week. Stay well, everybody. Share only good news. Mashiach now.
Thank
Yeah.
you,
Thank
Rabbi.
you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi Turn. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, everyone.
Hey, have a good evening.